I'm excited today to kind of go through a lot of the functionality, obviously, when it comes to manufacturing. Just kind of high level, I'll just do some housekeeping here, and then we'll kind of introduce why we're going to go through through manufacturing here today. First off, my name is Scott Frappier. I am the host here today for Stoneridge CONFAB. CONFAB is basically a live stream that we do every single week that really focuses on the emergent technologies that are inside of the Microsoft and related industry stacks that we work in. We've been doing this now for a little over almost 2 to 3 years. I kind of look back at it and I'm like, holy cow, we've had a lot of these different sessions that we've kind of covered. And it's just been a really good avenue and forum really for input from people that are curious about the Microsoft Dynamics capabilities, that are curious about the Microsoft technologies, and really any type of free consulting, as I call it, that people get as they go through and they try to understand then obviously how we use these tools to really address business challenges. So basically, if you haven't been on here before, welcome. Make sure you go into chat. I already got Rob here saying, how do you spell manufacturing? Any way you spell it, use AI. You nailed it, right? That's going to be kind of the future here. And even with the robots that are coming out lately, they're pretty cool to see. I just watched a video on Neo, which is a robot that isn't really fully automated. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I think this is going to be the next step in manufacturing. But it's going to be a lot of fun. So today we're talking about manufacturing because on November 5th, Stoneridge has a manufacturing event. So if you are new to the Microsoft channel, you're interested in learning more about obviously those capabilities or how AI is reshaping that, that session, that all-day event that our team is putting on, I highly recommend that you go to it. I know that Carly or somebody might be able to post a little bit more detail inside of the chat here, but the net result is it's a really good way for you to learn more about how AI is really reshaping the Microsoft Dynamics platform and all the ancillary technologies related to it. And what I want to do is I want to take some time to start here to basically go through and show what the base capabilities are of the Microsoft stack when it comes to manufacturing. And what do I mean by that? Well, we always get the question between Business Central versus Finance and Supply Chain Management, or Finance and Operations as it's known as its predecessor name. But which one should I pick, right? And it's never, ever a very easy answer. As everyone knows in consulting, the answer is always kinda, maybe. You got lots of different things that you got to think through in order to really then align that. So today what I want to do is I want to give you as the audience the objective measure here, the objectivity when it comes to these solutions, because I've actually implemented and supported both of them. It's really cool to see these technologies because candidly, when we look at the ERP platforms or the enterprise resource planning platforms that Microsoft has for our business system apps, they basically came from the same company, from a company called Navision Damgard that they acquired back in 2001. One was Exapta, or AX as we knew it in the past, and the other was what we called Navision, or NAV, and both of these became the cloud-centric ERP products. One became, for example, Business Central, so NAV turned into BC, and then the other, AX, turned into Finance and Supply Chain Management. So it's a really cool concept to see this growth and this change that has occurred inside of obviously the market, and to see the products that I pretty much grew up with be the mainstays inside of the Microsoft stack. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other great products that Microsoft has that come to the ERP side of it. GP, for example, is a really tried and true product where many customers have been using that for many, many years. And then we have Solomon as well, or SL, that was a really good project management one as well. So just note that these technologies are not the ones that Microsoft are enabling for cloud enablement. So obviously, if you're looking at this, you should probably be looking at the cloud-enabled products because that really is the future here. So with that, looks like Carly went ahead and put on the chat here just really quickly some links. So if you're on LinkedIn, I know she posted that in the chat there. Remember, we stream this to LinkedIn, Twitch, and also then to YouTube, so that way you can enjoy basically watching it wherever you feel most comfortable. All right, so with that, let's keep rolling here. So today, what do we want to do? we want to go through and do the comparison between those two products. We want to dive a little bit deeper to help educate you so that when you come to our November 5th event, we can dig even deeper then into how AI is really reshaping that, along with how our industry expertise has really helped manufacturers thrive inside of our environment. Because we all know there's lots of different factors that impact manufacturing and lots of different cost variables that you need to consider. So today what we want to do is show that comparison, understand what those base capabilities are, understand, for example, why you would look at one versus the other, and then spice in a little bit of the AI concept as well so that you can kind of be educated as to which products can I AI enable and then use, for example, additional capabilities to really drive my business forward. With that, remember, as this is CONFAB, if you have questions in LinkedIn, feel free to post them in the chat, comment. I'll be watching that as well. Same as on YouTube or Twitch. If you've got anything to say, if you want to go ahead and bring up a main point or something that excites you about what you're starting to see in manufacturing as well, bring it up. We'll talk about it here today and basically then kind of highlight that as we go through that. All right, so with that pitter patter, let's get at her. I'm going to go ahead and basically share my screen for the audience so we can start going through these different products. So one thing just really quickly here, it looks like I've got a 3-stream chat going on here, so I'm going to go ahead and hide some things in the background, and there we go. We'll have our chat up in the side here. I'll actually go ahead and hide that for now, and then as we have comments that come in, I'll make sure to go ahead and show that. But basically, what I want to do is I want to start with really a comparison between the two products, right? Because that's probably what you're most curious about, especially in manufacturing, is, well, which one can run my business? And the short answer is both. And it's not just as easy as, oh, I'm a $1 billion company, or I'm a $250 million company, or a $5 million company. There are other factors that go into the selection with that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this. But we're going to start obviously with a little bit of the product technology, because the consulting side of it is obviously where you'd want to engage then a partner a little bit deeper to give that expertise and qualify what really does fit. And when we say qualify, I know a lot of people are like, well, Scott, you mean just dollars and money? And yeah, there is some truth to that, but there's also the fact that there are other factors like transaction counts, number of users, how your business is broken out based upon the roles that are inside of the organization, the number of transactions and quantity, the seasonality of it, the growth plans, right? I just named 8 separate things that we talk through to really start quantifying that, and I even touch on the functionality of it, right? So there's different factors that we go through for that qualification that really right size you. And one of the unique things that we do at Stone Ridge is that we really do focus on making sure that we understand those needs. And what do I mean by that? Because it sounds kind of cavalier to start. Well, there's many ways to implement business systems. The most common ones are the ones where you've got this fully tailored handheld approach to implementing software, or you get this out of the box, this is the way you use it type of approach as well. And both are very valid, and both are really supported by our team as well, as well as a lot of gray in between. What I'm trying to communicate here is that they both have their advantages and disadvantages. After being in the industry for 25 years, I will tell you the cookie cutter is less satisfying for a lot of end users or users of the system, but leadership teams love it because it feels like it reduces risk. And then there's other things that happen that hurt that cultural aspect in the business. The other side of it, leaders don't like because they're really worried about the scope creep that can occur with it, but the end users love it because they get what they wanted. So that balance is something that you're going to have to consider obviously as you go through this journey, but just note that there are just ways that we can help you with that as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just resize my screen just a little bit. There we go for the stream, and let's go ahead and start with our first product inside of here. So this is what we call Business Central inside of the Microsoft platform. And as you can see, it's an application that I access via the web. I don't have my link shared on here right now for it, but what I've done is I've basically gone through to a URL or a website, and if I just kind of bring it down a little bit, you can see the URL there. It's in a Chrome browser. But what I can do is I can then use the functionality inside of Business Central to address the needs that I have as a manufacturer. Now, one of the things to note is that manufacturing inside of Business Central is only natively supported when we look at discrete manufacturing type environments. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean like things like we're building a cell phone, right? So we have components that are related to it. We have a finished good. We have sub-assemblies that we're going to be doing, but we're always producing to one product basically. And I just want to caveat this, right? It can do more than just discrete manufacturing, right? So I'm just talking about what we support natively out of the box. But one of the things to know that's different than other ERP platforms like Infor, Epicor, NetSuite is that there is a very rich partner network that has taken these platforms and then extended them to address then additional capabilities without it feeling like it's a third-party add-on. And that's a really important distinction with the Microsoft stack. Microsoft doesn't just build a product to address a business system, they build a platform to address your business needs. Whereas when we look at these other products that are out there, they build just an application to tackle it. And there's a lot of downside to the application mentality with it. Just candidly, we did do that almost 15 years ago. So I know this because I used to sell basically just Dynamics Nav, for example, and we would have one business solution to rule them all. But what we're seeing more and more often is that with this advent of AI and with all the right tools in the Microsoft stack, you can be more efficient and effective in your daily business process by using those right tools and having a very cohesive platform to work under. Whereas with others, you've got to buy, for example, a different CRM from a different vendor and a different EAM from a different vendor. And if you think about software like a culture, which it is, you're going to have different styles, different meanings, different names, different field names that are related to it that are not cohesive. But when we look at Dynamics, I think it's going to be really interesting for you as the audience to see that there's a lot of similarity between Business Central and the finance and operations platform, almost to the point where the terms are almost exactly the same as well. So this is a really interesting concept to kind of go through that really makes manufacturing easier as well for you, because if you understand how Business Central does it, you're going to understand then how we classify it, for example, inside of CE. Or if your business grows and you need to go to, for example, finance and operations, a lot of those same cultural mentalities that are there are going to extend to that application as well. Now, one of the things to note inside of BC is that I typically like to start, for example, at the item level inside of the solution. And so items are a way basically to identify our products, whether they're raw material items, sub-assemblies that we're going to be producing, or even then finished goods. And even kits, right? So any of those types of components where maybe you're a manufacturer that puts a particular product together and then you kit, for example, maybe there's oils or other types of products that you want to conjoin together, those can all be represented as an item inside of Business Central. And as you can see here, by default, the view looks like tiles, but remember, I can always go ahead and change this to like the list if that's what you're used to be able to interact then with these particular products or items. Now, if I just quickly take a quick look at, for example, not these tall tiles, but we'll go back to the tiles. We're going to go to this Antwerp conference table just as an example, and I click on it. Well, what we're going to see here is really the details about that particular product, right? So examples of that, and if you've used a business system before, this is kind of table stakes, right? Where, for example, I've got the description related to this particular product. I can tell if this is an inventoried or a service or non-inventoried product, for example. I can use different types of categories. I can have a purchaser assigned to it. I can define, for example, what happens when inventory goes negative. I can define how we cost this item. Is it FIFO or is it standard or is it specific, for example? And then I can define where it goes when it's posting on the general ledger. So when I'm selling a product, what's the revenue accounts that I hit? When I have a product I'm purchasing, what are my cost accounts, for example, right? So the item card really brings that all together inside of here. And candidly, like if we think about it, this is kind of the beginning then of what a manufacturer typically uses to go through and then define the products that they're going to be producing. Now, this is going to be fun because what we're going to do is we're going to show both, right? So this obviously was Business Central and how we interact with items and get to them. And we've got our main screen here. But what about finance and operations? Well, lo and behold, here we have finance and operations. So Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, just to cut right to it immediately, is a solution that is designed for what we call Tier 1 type implementations. So what does that mean? Because if you're not used to the lingo, it's going to be a little bit confusing to start. Think about large corporations or enterprises. What's considered a large corporation or enterprise? Eh, well, we'll start kind of the basics. Typically, maybe 500 million on up is where we start seeing, for example, that corporate type layer to start happening when it comes to, yeah, maybe I should be looking at finance and operations. Typically, it's going to be something where we're above easily 250 to 300, 400 users. That's also another factor. So those are just common metrics that the industry uses, but they're not the only metrics. Just case in point, I have customers that use Business Central that are multi-billion-dollar companies that run it for the core of their business. So there is not just a hard and fast rule that says one or the other fits. It's also about the organizational structure that you have. So for example, in a tier 1 product versus Business Central, which is classified as a small and medium business or SMB product, typically you have more users that are more specialized than in the role that they're doing. So when you build a business system application, you need to have more forms and screens that are more focused then towards that individual. And another example would be typically at larger enterprises, you've got multiple companies. You've got, for example, multiple legal entity structures, and you want to hold data at a higher level and then basically streamline that data, such as having products that are then released to multiple companies. So it's just a different way to handle, obviously, our business systems, and there's a pro and con to that. With great power comes great responsibility. What do I mean by that? Well, there's more data setup. There's more process engineering you have to think through. There's more people that are involved. There's more complex implementation processes. And it's not because it's a bigger product per se, but it's a product that has more people using it, so there are more conversations that need to occur when you're implementing it, which increases typically the cost of implementation of it. The other factor here is the fact that finance and operations, or what we'll typically call the supply chain management solution, supports 3 different manufacturing type capabilities natively. It supports discrete manufacturing, batch manufacturing, and also lean manufacturing natively inside of the solution without any third-party add-ons. Whereas in Business Central, we support discrete manufacturing natively, and then we do process, batch, continuous manufacturing, which is what we call process manufacturing as well inside of supply chain management. But we do that then through a third-party Avion that I will be showing here as well. So just note that there is much more inclusive capabilities natively inside of the supply chain management solution, or also known as finance and operations as the platform. Now, one of the unique things here is the fact if I look at my menu, my dashboard is a little bit different as well as I'm interacting with it. Whereas Business Central is hyper-focused on a particular role, you have, for example, these different types of workspaces. And in these workspaces, as an example, this is where you can then go ahead and then have the additional metrics, such as if I wanted to interact with the production floor, what I would see here is that I've got a menu that I can interact with to get to that information for production floor management inside of the solution. So just another example of it just being a little bit deeper in terms of what the capabilities are that are native inside of here. Now, one of the things I want to start with really is going to be this concept of products. Now, inside of Dynamics 365 Supply Chain Management, if I look at, for example, my inventory, not only do I have, or excuse me, my product maintenance as I go through this, my product information management, not only do I have a concept of products, but I also have a concept of release products inside of the solution. So what does that mean? Well, inside of the enterprise solution here, I have the ability to create products that are at a high level that contain a lot of the basic information that typically would be used no matter what legal entity is using this particular product. An example would be, as you can see here, what are the export controls that are related to this particular product? What are the NMFC codes and the STC and harmonized system codes that we may associate with it? What are some of the basic descriptions related to it? What are, for example, on the product side, the basic unit of measures that we have that are related to it? What we can do inside of the supply chain management solution is we can build products at a higher level and then release that product to multiple companies. So as an example here, this youth accessory set that we have is actually a product that lives in both two other companies or legal entities, as we call them, inside of finance and operations, so that I can do transactions against this particular product in those organizations. So the case in point here is that if you are a manufacturer that has many legal entities by default, or many companies that you then want to have products that exist in each one of those, finance and operations is going to have more capabilities around that, because it allows you basically to go through and then maintain that data at a higher level and then release that into obviously those legal entities. Whereas Business Central, for the company I'm in, for example, in my environment that I am in right now, which is Cronus USA, I'm not going to have a product I can set up and then release that to multiple other companies inside of the solution. So a really major differentiating factor right off the bat when it comes to just even the master data. Now, another interesting thing here, if I go ahead and look at our product information management, is the depth of what release products have inside of the supply chain management solution kind of natively. So if we go back to our item card, and I just want to pop both up here so that we can kind of take a look at them, and I'm going to go to that conference table as an example. Like, you're probably looking at this and you're like, Scott, that's a lot of information. Like, I've got this picture, I've got all these details of all these different fields that are in here. A lot of these fields are hidden, but I can even show less or show more to basically show more of the fields that are inside of here. Well, what does it look like from an item card perspective inside of the supply chain management solution? And so what we'll do here is we'll go to one of the products that's kind of native in here. So let's go to our wonderful A products. We'll go to our HDMI cables. So that's demo data that's inside of here. And if I click on this particular release product, we're going to see there's just a lot more inside of here. So both products, from an AI enablement perspective, have, for example, Copilot on the right over here. So right over here that we're looking, that's going to be our Copilot enablement. Same concept exists inside of, obviously, finance and supply chain, with our Copilot information being at the top up here that we can interact with. But this is where it just kind of separates almost immediately. So we can have images that are related to it. Great. But everything when it comes to the product maintenance, as you can see, is much more detailed inside of really this finance and operations-based platform. And why is that? Well, because for a manufacturer, there are way more things that an enterprise-based solution typically needs to handle that a small and medium business do not need to handle. So what are examples of that? So let's go through engineering change management. So as a manufacturer, you may want to have different revisions of product that you have, which is supported inside of Business Central, but you may want to then control that by doing notices and basically going through a full process of approval to go and take an engineering revision and then change that inside of the solution. And so as an example, natively inside of finance and operations that is supported, whereas in Business Central, we have to use a third party to tackle that. Now, that depends on where you're at in your org structure. Because here's the other thing just to kind of note too. I have heard so many times customers at the small and medium business level wanting those capabilities. And if they want them in Business Central, we can use a third party to add that in, like a application, like you'd install AutoCAD in Windows to do that. Well, you would do the same thing as well then inside of Business Central. But one of the things that I've noticed just through my tenure is that there's a lot of small and medium businesses that have leadership levels that come from higher end companies that bring that culture to a small and medium business product, but they don't think about this concept called death by transaction in a manufacturing environment. And what do I mean by that? Well, just because you can, does that really mean you should? And that's something that really needs to be discussed by when you're going through your implementation process as to what are really those critical factors that are absolutely needed for your organization to be successful when implementing that solution. So once again, Business Central is going to really focus more on the small and medium business perspective with it, which says very commonly, we don't need to do engineering change management. We need to take the engineering revisions and save them in a SharePoint site, for example, and then have a revision number. But what we do inside of Business Central is we just create a new BOM revision. And then if we did have some product, we'd sell out the last of the product. Or, for example, maybe take the existing product that's on the shelf and rework it. We would do that inside of Business Central. But I don't need a complex approval methodology or release cadence or rules around basically the categories of products that are being introduced in the business system to drive that. I handle that externally as part of that process. And so once again, it's kind of up to you. You can get that third-party add-on if you want to, but that also defines more why we have more fields and why we have more inside of here to really go through and do that. So let's keep on rolling here, and it looks like I've got this wonderful little Twitcher thing that's goodbye to the block list, Mr. Whatever you are, that is a bot that's inside of here. So let's go through a little bit more here. So obviously from a manufacturing capability, if we look at Business Central and go back to it, let's look at, for example, some of the other concepts that are related to it. So one of the things here that we can kind of see is that we have this ability to define what we call a replenishment system inside of Business Central. And this is really kind of the start of what we would look at to really drive, for example, what we would manufacture inside of the solution. So just as an example here, if I go ahead and filter this down by clicking on my filter pane, and I say I want to filter by the replenishment system as an example, and I want to say I want everything that is a production order item, for example, this is going to show me then all of the items that we typically go through and then manufacture. So in here, as you can see, I've got a couple of different products, and it looks like they're coffee makers that are inside of here. And if I go to these coffee makers, what I should be able to do is at this level, look at the related information for this and see, for example, the bill of materials that is used to actually go through and produce this particular product. We call that a production BOM inside of Business Central that drives that. So what's cool about this is that you can then have, for example, all the different types of parts that are used to go through and do that production process. You can have quantity scaling that's related to it. You can define, for example, maybe a scrap percentage. So if you've got, for example, maybe some fixed length items that you're only using a rod, we'll say, and it's 12 inches and you only need 9 inches in the manufacturing process, but you can't reuse that for example, 3 inches for anything else. Well, what you can do is you can set a scrap percentage so that way the 3 is automatically scrapped, and so that cost is then contained obviously into that particular product. So you can set that up as well inside of here. But what you can also do is you can have different versions that are related to this as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, versions allows for me then to create, for example, a new product that's related to this base product that is the revision that's related to this product. So as you have improvement, you can see that, and you can even then affect basically the starting date, as you can see right here inside of the solution, so that when you're producing new production orders, you can basically go through that production process with the current revision of product that you have inside of the solution. And the other cool thing about this is that you can select as well different revisions. So that way, if a customer asks for a very specific revision, well, technically you can say use this specific revision then on a sales order, or even when you're going through and creating that production order. So that way you can always go to a prior revision for production if needed as well. So it's a really nice capability that's native inside of here. Now, one of the things to note is that when we think about production inside of Dynamics, we typically don't have, for example, a conjoined bill of material and route. Because part of this is that we have obviously the materials that are needed, but we also have the steps that we have to go through to do that particular production process. So inside of Business Central, what we did is we actually took the actual related information here and we separated then the route from this. So just as an example here, if I take a look at some of the additional details that are related to it, what I should be able to do here is get to some of the routing details. And if I go down just a little bit as well, I should be able to see that routing number. But basically, what I can do here is I can then specify what are the steps that we go through to do that particular production process. So just as a quick example, as I expand this out, I've got, for example, work centers and machine centers, time that's done with it, and that time then has some type of cost that's related then to those work centers or machine centers inside of the solution. So this is the route that we go through to produce then this particular product. And we can do a lot of cool things with this. We can do, for example, serial versus parallel operations inside of Business Central. So that way, concurrently, we can start production on maybe lower level assemblies that have to go to different work centers or machine centers that then join at a higher level and then even split off from there potentially as well. So you can go ahead and set up all of that to really go through and then drive, obviously, some of that functionality inside of here. So a really cool concept when it comes to that base manufacturing capability inside of here. Now, the other things that we're able to do then from here is take that and then link, for example, the route information to the bill of material that we're related to. What do I mean by that? Well, in our bill of material, we may not need a particular product until a certain step, right? And how do we do that? Well, we define what's called a routing link code. So that way, when we're asking for forward flushing of products or back flushing of products, we're basically able to specify what products are needed at what stage of the route when we're going through that particular production process. Because natively, if we're doing a discrete manufacturing environment, we need to be able to do, for example, forward flushing and back flushing as that native capability inside of the solution. So it just really allows for, as you can see here, some great capability to go through those manufacturing operations. And then finally, from a costing perspective, there is a lot of that inside of here. So if we look at the related information from this, when we look at our bill of materials and production, our calculate production standard cost is also a very major component inside of the solution. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've got to explode through the bill of materials. We have all this material that we're going to be using to produce this particular product. Well, I need to cost it then at the highest level, so that way when I'm selling it, I can either do a cost plus, for example, or I know what my list price is going to be, so that way I'm not basically cannibalizing my margin, right? So we have the ability then to take the costing information and roll it up to all these different levels to calculate what we call our single level or our multi-level costs that are then associated basically with this particular product. What does that mean? Highest level, if you're a manufacturer, think about like standard cost. When you produce something and you use more material, you want a material variance for that production, so that way you can track and see what production is having a major impact in terms of those cost variances that are in your manufacturing operations, or the labor, or the overhead, meaning for some reason you had to flip a different machine to use to do the production of this, and the overhead rate of that particular machine is more expensive than the default machine that you're using, and you want to be alerted by a financial means basically to drive that. So these are all going to be kind of native capabilities inside of the solution to really drive those costing methods that you're going to use then in manufacturing. And just as a case in point with this, we've got lots of manufacturers that use standard cost. We've got lots of manufacturers that use FIFO or LIFO even, first in, first out. Really what it boils down to that I have seen through my experience is how do you want to track the variances that are related to production based upon the standard that you created? Either you create the standard in the bill of material in the route, and then you do reporting that looks at if you've gone over on hours or if you use the machine more, well, you can run reports that then do that without following a standard cost that's related to it. Whereas others want to use a standard cost because the examples I like to give with this is that when manufacturing is occurring, it may not just be manufacturing goals that you're trying to accomplish with it. Maybe it's commissions, right? Maybe part of this is that any type of impact for a variance is what you want to track separately to provide management commissions, for example, to the production floor processes, which would be the managers in production. And then you don't want to impact, for example, the sellers and the profit margin that they're expected or anticipating to be able to take off of that. Whereas in maybe other situations in different organizations, you'll take that cost and roll it then into the final finished good. And then the seller, for example, has to just bear with that. They have to know that to a degree, and they have to understand that impact of why their margin might be increasing or decreasing. And then there's kind of the middle ground. There's this concept called average cost, right? Where you average it across all of these different products from a perpetual perspective, where you can define daily, monthly, weekly, whatever it may be, that you want the actual cost then to either average or to perpetually change as you have items fall off and then add new products. That average may go up or down. So there's a lot of different goals that we can tackle then for manufacturers to help that costing based perspective as well inside of Business Central. So as you can see here, it's not a little bit, it's a lot of capability that's native inside of here. All right, let's go now over to production now inside of here, right? So now we're going to start looking at, for example, production inside of finance and supply chain management. And let's just say it does all that and then a little bit more, because obviously it's going to be a little bit deeper as we go through some of those different types of production processes. Now inside of here, I've got definitely just a bunch of different products that I can actually go through and then potentially manufacture, right? But one of them that we'll take a look at will be like let's take a look at a speaker, because that's kind of the demo data that's inside of here. Now, inside of a speaker, for example, this is an example where we actually have this set up from a model group perspective of standard cost. So instead of the costing methodology being directly on the particular product like we were looking at inside of Business Central, it's actually set up in what is called a model group. And in this model group, there's a lot of different things that we can impact even further. We can, for example, say whether this product is stocked or not. We can specify, for example, the different costing methodology, which is very similar then to Business Central. In fact, they're basically the same. FIFO, LIFO, weighted, standard, and then moving average. So in Business Central, we'll have weighted, and then we'll have moving, we'll have standard, we'll have LIFO. Date control LIFO, not as much unless we're using lot numbers, for example. So that might be a little bit of a difference, but then FIFO is going to be the same as well. But there's also then other behaviors, such as do we allow negative inventory, and we define that at the model group and not at the individual product. Do we have, for example, FIFO date controlled picking that's needed? So in Business Central, we have FIFO, but also from a picking perspective with it, we can actually define how the system will actually reserve the inventory in the warehouse to pick in a FIFO order as well. So remember, FIFO is a little bit different. It's first expired, first out. It's typically used for products that you may have like some type of chemical or some type of acid or some type of product that's going to expire, for example. Well, that would typically then be used inside of here to drive that. Once again, Business Central also has that, but it does a little bit more advanced capabilities when it comes to the FIFO requirement, such as making sure it consolidates the requirements or uses the same batch selection. What is that? Imagine you're a furniture manufacturer and you have bolts of leather, and if you don't know this in the furniture manufacturing industry, different bolts of leather have different coloring that's related to them, even though they're the same product technically, because the dye that was used maybe was a little bit different, right? And so you want to make sure you always select then that bolt, which would be in our system a lot number or batch number, and then we can actually make it so it selects that then using FIFO date control as well as part of it. So just a lot of more advanced capabilities that are inside of here to drive that. Now, when we look at then the inventory from an engineering perspective, this is also kind of similar. So this is like our production BOM. It's called our BOM versions inside of here that I can click on that then go through and then share, for example, the additional manufacturing details that are needed to produce this particular product. And you can see here, it's kind of the same, right? You've got your header that has some of the information as to when the effectivity date is and what quantity it's effective from. One of the big departures here is the fact that we can engineering control these, right? So while we can have production versions inside of Business Central, we can have engineering change management inside of finance and operations that makes it so that you have to go through an engineering change notice that then has a disposition, that then has an approval, that then has, for example, certification, that then goes and then produces a new BOM version inside of here as part of that process. So it's a much more complex process that you can incorporate then from your discrete manufacturing perspective. As I kind of look over to the right here, what we can see is that we basically have the same type of concept of quantity, quantity per each finished unit of measure that we're going to create, and then also what site and warehouse that we're going to be interacting with to basically go through that production process. So this is where we get into these multi-site operations that we can do natively then inside of finance and operations that allows me then to produce a product across multiple warehouses. So imagine you've got a campus, which would then be multiple buildings, and one building is producing one product and the other building is producing another product. We can accurately reflect that in the site warehouse mentality or structure that we can't do exactly inside of Business Central. And while I say we can't do it exactly, once again, I've done this in Business Central. How do I do it? Well, our location codes become a combination of the site and warehouse that denotes them so that we have physical segregation, but we don't have, for example, a site or a campus ID. Instead, that's encapsulated basically inside of what we call a location inside of Business Central. So it's just a little bit cleaner than inside of finance and operations for multi-site manufacturing inside of the solution kind of natively without having to do, for example, purchase order or sales orders between legal entities or transfer orders that are inside of it. Now, once again, you can kind of do both inside of Business Central as well. Now, beyond this, if we go a little bit further, we also on the engineering side here have the ability to define those different types of routes as well, right? So same concept inside of Business Central. We can have all these different operations and steps that we go through to do the production, and we can assign, for example, the runtime and then the quantity that we can process in that runtime. So installation of wiring for every hour is what's set up inside of this particular environment. We can process 8 of these speakers as part of that job, what we did for our tack times then from a manufacturing perspective. So really similar in terms of even then the operations, parallel or serial. And here then is where there are some major differences that start to occur. So we can define different types of priorities that are related to this. Now in Business Central, you could define, for example, the number, the operation number, to kind of define that priority. And then you can say what's called next operation, which is actually here as well, but it doesn't state whether or not it's a secondary or primary based manufacturing process, right? So that's going to be the very first thing to note. But one of the biggest changes between that of Business Central and finance and operations when it comes to discrete manufacturing is this concept of what we call resource requirements that are related then to a particular product. So what do I mean by that? High level, you've got a ton of different machines that are on the production floor. About 5 of those machines can do the exact same job as what the machine would be if you put it in the route and stated use this machine all the time. So an example would be inside of Business Central, you would set up a work center and maybe even a machine center that's in that work center. And that machine center then would be that machine that you would use by default to go through that production process. But let's say you've got a high volume all of a sudden of that particular product. Well, that machine is going to get fully loaded very quickly. And in order to change it or shift it to go to a different machine, you've got to go through and then say, all right, start using this different route now. So you have to set up a different configuration route. So that way we can start spreading this load to different machines as part of that particular production process. So it's not that hard, right? But you do have to do some more data setup then to drive that. Well, what a resource requirement does inside of finance and operations is it makes it so that you can actually go through and then define for these particular resources, which I'll classify as a work center, or resource groups, a group of work centers, or the capabilities of those work centers, or the skills or courses or certificates or titles. Find a machine that can do this production process. So instead of setting up multiple routes, you define, for example, the step of operation that you're going to be doing, and then you define, well, what type of machine do I need to be able to perform that particular operation? So examples of this, in this example, any type of machine or what we call resource inside of finance and operations that has been tagged with the capability to do cabinets is where I want you to go through and then send that production process to. So that way that work center will be informed then, or that resource as we call it in finance and operations, will be informed of the work that they need to be able to do. But you can even get to titles. Let's say you're driving a kosher shop, right? Well, what you can do is you can have a rabbi bless that product at the very end, and that title is associated with that resource. And so that resource schedule and the capacity and reservation for that rabbi to be there at the end of the production line would also then be supported. So just an example, right? You can have different titles, obviously, but the point here is that we are allowing inside of finance and operations for you to set up the steps that are needed to produce it, and then have the system do the selection in terms of what's available to go through that production process. So that's a very marked change then between them. Now, there are some other ones here too that I want to show because this is really important. So we talked about inside of Business Central, we have these items in discrete manufacturing that we can do, but inside of also the finance and operations environment, we also have the ability to do process manufacturing inside of here as well. So just as an example, some of the process manufacturing items that I have, for example, if I am making foam panels, what I can do here is I can look at, for example, not my BOM, but my potential formula that's related to this particular product. Because as part of my production process, I may be, for example, consuming different materials, but what I might also be doing is creating additional products, which are either co-products or byproducts, that would also be produced inside of this process. So this is a big difference between discrete manufacturing, and it has a huge impact on your production process. Let's talk through a couple of examples. So you have a process like this one where we're doing foam panels, and what we're also doing as we produce this is that we're going to have dampening foam and foam remnants that are inside of here, and we don't want this byproduct to go into the cost potentially of that particular product because it's a byproduct. Whereas the co-product that we're producing, we may want to then produce and then put, for example, on the actual shelf, but we want to take some of the costs that we used in the actual material and labor to produce the primary product and then allocate that basically to that secondary or co-product. Well, in this example, we are doing that by basically taking 40% of whatever cost that occurs when we're doing that production process to produce this item, and we're allocating it now to that co-product, whereas in this byproduct, we are not doing any of that. And technically, inside of finance and operations, a byproduct is not something that we consume in any other production process. They would be, for example, if we are growing shrimp, the water that would need to be cleaned before we brought it back into the system would actually be a byproduct because we would not want to reuse that contaminated water in any other production process. So byproducts are typically going to be the items that you're going to figure out how to get rid of, whereas co-products are the products that typically are used in the production process or come out of the production process that you're going to put on the shelf potentially as well. Other examples, like if you think about like ethanol production, right? You're going to have many products that go in, but at the end of that ethanol production, you're going to have obviously ethanol that's going to be the output, but you're also going to have this mash, and this mash typically can be used to be put into feed for animals. So that would be another example then of a process manufacturing operation where you're going to have both co-products and potentially byproducts as you go through that. Now, the other thing to note is that when we think about, for example, formulas as well, they also have different types of requirements when it comes to like ingredients and compensating principles. An example would be like if you got sulfuric acid that's on the shelf and it's 80% sulfuric, 80% pure sulfuric, and you need to get it down to a 50% diluted ratio for whatever you're producing, well, you're going to want to have a compensating principle of water that's basically going to go into that sulfuric acid to basically reduce then obviously that particular dilution, right, rate of that particular product. So the system has the ability then to use that and to calculate that as well. So as you can see here, just a lot of great capabilities in terms of then what you do from a manufacturing operation inside of here. And then finally, one last thing, like I mentioned before, is the fact that if we look at, for example, the different types of manufacturing that's inside of here, we also have the ability to do some of the lean manufacturing. Now, this environment doesn't have this exposed inside of here, but what would happen then from a lean manufacturing would be really that you have the ability to go through and then do, for example, water spiders that are going and then picking particular products and Kanbans. And in fact, I think actually I did enable that, so we'll just do a quick search here just to see if it pops up in the search history. But this would then allow for you, there we go, the production control is going to have it, that's right. So if I go to my production control for this as an example, inside of my production control here, this is where then I can have, for example, circulating cards for Kanbans. So if you understand this concept, basically much more common and basically discrete operations. It's not that it can't be done in process or batch or continuous operations, but it's much more common in discrete operations. You have basically a cart of all the materials that are needed to be able to produce the item that you're going to be working on. An example might be like a carburetor. Like maybe, for example, you're a huge carburetor manufacturer, and what you do is you have all the floats, all the springs, all the pins, everything else that's needed, the nozzle, the spray assembly, whatever it may be, that are all in these little cards, and you've got a fixed amount of quantity that you need to produce. So you produce that particular product, that carburetor, right? You put it on the finish bin with it, and you're picking all these other ones that you're doing, and eventually you run out of one, and what you do is you take that card in your work center and you put it behind you and you say, hey, I need this particular product, and there's somebody that's basically walking around that's taking your finished goods that you produced and bringing them to the next stage, or also finding that card and then going back to the stocking location, grabbing that, and then, or the retail mart or whatever you want to call it, basically grabbing that product in that bin and then bringing that bin back with a brand new one, and then that card just basically gets circulated or it's printed out every single time as you go through those operations. So it's a concept like Joe even mentioned in here, production flows. They're great for organizing, your tack times and the flow through the lean setup, absolutely, because once again, lean manufacturing is all the focus on waste. Like, let's have people that are doing production focus on production, and then we have the water spiders go and grab the particular products that go to the retail mart and then grab that and bring it back as part of that production process. So that's also a native capability inside of here as well. Now let's go through a couple more features because we don't have too much time. I wanted to kind of just start those, right? So other capabilities, like when we look at production, like let's actually create a production order here for this particular product. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and we're going to go into really our production. So if I click on our menu here, I explore more roles and I look at all this great things that I can do. What I have here is my actual production that's inside of here, and what I can do is I can create, for example, different type of production orders inside of the system. Now inside of Business Central, there are really 4 different states that production orders can be in. They can be in a planned production order, a firm planned, a released, or a finished production order. Planned production orders, no impact on inventory capacity. Firm planned, we're starting to impact schedule and potentially then also inventory. Released, we're now working on these. Finished, we're done producing these, right? So a production order is just copying, for example, the details of that that BOM that we were looking at in the route and brings them basically over into the production order. So if I do a new one just really quickly here, I can say, for example, I want to use this particular product, and what I would do is I would refresh the production order to copy basically the lines, the route, and the components that are needed to create then the actual BOM that's related to it. Obviously I forgot my quantity, so let's do our quantity. Let's go ahead and refresh that, click on OK again, and then from there what we should see then is really what we're producing and the quantity that we're producing it. At our line level, we should be able to see the component need that's there, and I can override this at this level as well. I can put new ones in here, I can add them, I can change the quantities that are related to it. This is really just kind of the default that it brought into here. And I can even, for example, change them to like back flushing so that when I actually go through and then finish this production order, that'll auto consume those particular products, whereas maybe by default it was set up as manual. And then finally, the routing details is also associated with this. And what I can do is I can start the production process by clicking on, for example, the production journal, and then taking this and then recording, yeah, this took me, for example, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. I produced 2 of these. I consumed 5 of these. I went through all these different types of operations, and then I can post that to basically then reflect that inside of here. So you've got the ability then inside of Business Central to go through that manufacturing process. And there's many different ways to tackle this. The production journal is a really common one that we use to go through that particular process, but you also have the ability inside of the manufacturing to do, for example, different types of journals that are inside of here, so that instead of, for example, doing that one, I could come here to my more roles, I could look at my operations, and inside of here, what I could do is I could actually go through and then do these journals to consume or output what I'm producing at each of these different steps. And then if you want more like MES-based capabilities or manufacturing execution systems, there are third parties that's natively snap into here that you can then have open that you can then interact with to do that production process. So once again, kind of basic, right? Well, what does it look like then from a F&O perspective, right? Well, actually really similar. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Let's basically go through, and I want to take just a really quick look at our different items that are inside of here. So we'll go back to our recently released products. And I think I may have a product in here that I was demoing just recently from production that we could actually go through and take a look at. So as we take a look here, yeah, I've got a couple of them, like, let's see here. Let's do like town hall. Let's take a quick look at it. I don't think this is set up actually as a batch. In fact, let's just do this. I'll do this. Let's go through our demo data with this. So what I'm going to do just really quickly is we're going to go into our production floor management. So what I would do is I go to my production control and I go to my all production orders. And then what I would do is very similar to what we were looking at inside of Business Central. I'd create a new production order up here. And in this production order, this is kind of where things deviate just a little bit. So we'll do that speaker as an example. So we should hopefully have a list of the speakers that show into here in just a hot second. There we go. We got our mid-range speaker. And then I'm going to do one of them just as an example. And what we should see then is that the BOM in the route would be pulled into here, and I can even select, for example, those different types of BOMs and routes. Now in this example, it's catching me already saying, hey, Scott, your particular BOM is not approved. So let's just do that really quickly here in the background. We'll click on the item. We'll go to the item number, which will bring up the item card inside of here. Inside of the item card, then, what I should be able to do is go back into, for example, that bill of material. So we'll go to our engineer, we'll go to our BOM version, and then what we will do is we will take that BOM version and approve it. So there we go. Please approve it. Has not been approved. Bill of materials, let's activate. Version is not approved and cannot be activated. Okay. So it looks like it's not a demo until we have something go wrong, right? Well, why would my BOM not be approved here? So let me take a look at a different product just really quickly here to see if we can find one that would be actually approved. So I'm going to go take a look here. We'll do our D products again. Let's do our standard speaker. Does that pull in? And it does. Well, we'll do it that way then. I'll have to go look at it. I might have done some engineering change control on that other product that drove that. Either way, we've got this product. Let's go ahead and create it. Very similar in concept, where it's basically going to then generate, take that master data that we had before, and then copy it over into this particular production order. Now, this is where there's some differences pretty substantially as well. So as an example here, in our production order, not only do we have just those 4 states like we had inside of Business Central, but we have multiple states. We have an estimate state, we have a release state, we have a start state, we have a report as finished state, and an ed state. So not all the ones that we typically interact with here are going to be very similar. So estimate is like our planned, released is going to be like our firm planned, start is like our release products, basically our release production orders inside of Business Central. So kind of similar, but then there's 2 others, report is finished, where we finish it and produce all the output, and then we may end it later because we may have additional costs that we want to add to it or track with it as well. But on this, we still then have our BOM that's related to it, and we also then have our route that's related to it. And just like inside of the actual other environment inside of Business Central, we can make changes to this as we see fit. So the only other major thing that starts to deviate here is the fact that when we think about like production, inside of finance and operations, we also then have, for example, additional items that we can actually interact with from an MES perspective. So manufacturing execution allows for us basically to define all these different operations that we then may be interacting with. And examples of this is that we may be tracking, for example, time at each of these different operations. We may have jobs that are running that we want to report feedback against. We may want to, for example, highlight a particular job and then start it and then go through that production process and say we're doing one more, for example, inside of here. And then from there, as we go through that start process, we may want to then use MES to then record, for example, the consumption that's related to it. And how would we do that? Well, we look at our active jobs, for example, and then report the progress. And that progress, then we may change the status related to it. We may adjust the materials that we consumed as part of that process as well. But we do this then on basically an MES-based system, which, as you can imagine, is typically a touch-based system inside of here as well. So even further, when we look at finance and operations, it's going to have this natively as a part of it. Now, one of the final things I want to leave with, because we just don't have enough time to go through all of this, and I think it just gives you a really good comparison to start here. But when we talk about this, I think throughout the session, you might be like, well, Scott, I should always be going to finance and operations. And the answer is no. I mean, it really isn't, because you may be then having more setup and more complexity and more cost for your organization, because even though it's deeper in manufacturing, it's also deeper in finance. It's also deeper in sales order management, in purchase order management. And that death by transaction, you really have to be cognizant of. So what do we do in those situations? Well, we do the best of both worlds. So inside of Business Central here, we talked about, oh wait, we don't do process manufacturing, right? But we do with a Yavion add-on that we resell that's part of the solution. And you can't even tell that it's different. As an example, if I go into my particular area and I look at my roles inside of this bakery company, inside of my manufacturing now, I have some additional capabilities that have been added to this that are the manufacturing capabilities then when it comes to then the Yavion Pro Batch capability. And what this allows me to do then is to define then, as you can see here, we'll pick on our cheese Danish inside of our bakery company here, but it allows for us to define, for example, products that have work centers and additional steps that they go through when they do that production process. But what we can also do inside of here is we can define what are called joint products that also allow for us to do co-product and byproduct output. So once again, you can have the best of both worlds by having the simplicity and ease of use of Business Central, because it's at the right size for a small and medium business customer. But then you can use, for example, Yavion's Pro Batch based capability to basically tackle then maybe some of those process manufacturing, batch manufacturing, or continuous manufacturing requirements that you may have inside of your organization. And just as an example inside of ours, you can see I'm looking at a bakery company, but there's a pharmaceutical company that we have inside of here as well. And then any other type of process manufacturing is also then supported by using that particular add-on as well. So like I said, don't generalize it. We look at the requirements to figure out like what is the best solution for you, because all these then are AI enabled. And as we'll talk, obviously, on our November 5th event, we've got a lot more capabilities that go even deeper than that as well. So with that, what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and flip back over into my one-speaker chat that's inside of here. We had some great feedback that was going through. Thank you again, Deb and Joe, for the feedback that you provided here as we went through this. Yeah, hopefully this kind of just gave you a real comparison in terms of obviously those manufacturing capabilities. And when we look at then what we're going to be covering on November 5th, like I said, if you've got time to come join, please sign up. Join the event. We'd love to have you there. That way you can ask more pertinent questions maybe that are specific to your industry, or maybe more focused on the AI questions that you may have. We'd love to have you as we go through that. So with that, have a fantastic rest of your week. And from 2 weeks from now, we'll make sure we broadcast another CONFAB that will be covering obviously more of the emergent capabilities obviously of the Microsoft platform. So with that, thank you much and have a great rest of your week.